who have experienced life, who have been wounded by life, who come to it as they are. And this, I think, very much is the experience of the Israelites in Egypt. It's this traumatized people that has really suffered, that has really lived, that has known fear and loss and despair. And that is the generation that experienced Torah. And this, for me, when I think about contemporary Jewish life, when I think about contemporary Israel, is very, very powerful. That brokenness is actually what makes the Israelites ready for revelation. And it's what opens them to new possibilities also in law. And so Ephraim's going to take us into the next text.
Thanks so much, Ayelet. I'm moving us down into a biblical example of what can happen in that open space. So in the Talmudic text that Rabbi Cohen showed, we kind of looked at the possibilities. We talked about the possibility of being in a space that's unfixed and that's open. And we're looking here at the beginning of the 27th chapter of the book of Numbers. So to give a little context to this text, in chapter 26, yet another census has been taken. These seem to happen a lot in the Bible. And this time the census is being taken to figure out how the land of Israel will be divided, so that every person, meaning adult male, will get a piece of land. And emerge in this chapter, there's been a patriarch of a family who's passed away, who has 5 daughters, and they realize that they're going to enter the land instead of being on equal footing, so that everyone kind of has a parcel enough to feed their family. They will enter the land of Israel without any property to their name, completely without power, completely without property. And they approach Moshe. Their names are listed here as Machla, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, Tirzah, and ask for a portion of the land, even though they're not patriarchs of families. They're women, which is kind of a very radical notion. And I think without even looking at any commentary, it's pretty clear that this would not have happened. I can't imagine this kind of claim of radically rewriting property law so that a class that had been completely written out of being able to inherit property would be able to get property once you have people living in their own land and a whole system of how property is inherited established. And yet at this moment, before that system is set up, when things are blown wide open because everyone is living in tents in the wilderness, that possibility is really still there. And so the chapter opens as these 5 daughters, first Vatikravna, first they gather and come close, and then Vata'amodna, and then they stand before Moshe, and Elazar Cohen, the high priest, and then Nesi'im, the assembly, and the whole Haidan, the whole community at the entrance to the house of meeting. And in that moment, these women's voices can possibly change the course of history. And strangely enough, Moshe does not know what to do in that moment and asks God what to do. And God says, Cain. God says, you know what? They're right. these 5 daughters of Tzalofchad, they actually have a better idea of how to do agricultural and how to do property law than I ever could have thought of. And yes, they should get a share in the land of Israel. And we need to rethink the whole system I had set up in the previous chapter. I particularly liked a note about this verse from Ha'amek Davar, this commentary. If I'm scrolling down just a little further, I just need to click a little differently. Well, okay, that works. Who is the Netziv? This is Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the last head of the yeshiva of Volozhin in Russia in the 19th century, the father of Meir Bar Ilan, the namesake of Bar Ilan University, who notes that the verse kind of gets 2 introductions. First, we're told these 5 women, they come close and then they stand before Moshe, and he wonders why that's necessary. And he points out that really this was a very uncommon thing, that women would feel empowered to stand before Moshe in this way, and that they were standing outside at first, and it took Moshe granting them permission to let them in, to hear them, and to shift history and to shift law in this way. And it was only once he heard their questions that the whole system of inheritance could be changed in that way. And I was reminded of something that I heard from a speaker we had on our West Coast NIF breakfast briefing just yesterday. We had Avi Dabush, who'd been a longtime NIF employee in Israel and now is the executive director of Rabbis for Human Rights. He had noted that Rabbis for Human Rights had set up a hotline during this COVID crisis to help folks who lost their jobs navigate the unemployment system there in Israel. And just like here, it's a system that's become deeply flooded with claims, and many people lost their jobs, and it's a hard system to navigate, something many people here too know as well. And they had set up folks who spoke in Hebrew and in Arabic and in Russian who could help folks navigate that system. And it was only when they heard those people kind of come and speak to them on those calls that they realized just how much folks who were living in deep poverty were completely written out of the system, and how many new claims they might have and problems they might have that need to be addressed. And what Rabbis for Human Rights is going to be doing, and what they're doing as a part of NIF's crisis action plan in dealing with this moment, is making sure that the voices of those who are most out of power, including people who are most economically vulnerable in this time, are being heard in the halls of power, and that as laws are being written to navigate this moment, that those voices are being heard. So that comment of Ha'amek Davar, that these people would not have been heard until they had been brought in, immediately made me think of this moment of what's going on in Israel at this moment, when it simply took a new outlet for voices to be heard, to realize kind of systemic inequalities, namely that that folks who are the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, the most economically out of the halls of power, really need to have their voices lifted, and that we have this midbar moment where those voices can really be brought into the system and can be lifted up and heard.
So
I turn it back to you.
Yeah, I think we have a couple of minutes to open up to questions. So yes, am I reading the time right? Yes. So first of all, I just want to say that I love that we're in this class together with Ruti, who probably knows the landscape of Israeli social change organizations better than almost anybody on the planet. And so I love that that you're convening this conversation. And we wanted to invite anybody, if you want to either raise a hand or put a question in the chat on any of the texts that we just discussed, or any of the pieces that we mentioned. We'd love to invite you to do that. I see that we already have a comment about an alternate translation of the midrash, that of the text, the Ha'amek Davar that Ephraim just brought, a kind of different reading of.
I like that.
Which is really nice. The idea that the women were coming forward or approaching or coming close, and which I think also kind of adds to the subversive nature of what they were doing, that they were really they were being brought in a whole different way, because they spoke up, because they claimed their place. And that's very much what we're seeing, certainly in times like this. And we're seeing it here in the U.S. We're seeing it, of course, in Israel. That while it's kind of pat to say this is the great equalizer. Of course, people who are on the margins, people who are already living in more difficult circumstances, are experiencing the fallout, both in terms of the health issues and in terms of the economic fallout, in such a different way. And it's required people to step forward and demand change in a different way. So I'm seeing a lot of great questions.
Yeah, let me know if you need help seeing the chat. If you want to stop the share, you could possibly see it better.
Might be useful.
There you go.
What?
So how about
I'm going to
I have
share a link to that sheet too, so folks who want to get
Sure.
a second look at it on their own, I'll send a link to the sheet on Safaria so folks can print it or have access to it after the call.
So how about I go back to the beginning of the questions and ask people to, Emily, did you want me to just read your question, or I see Emily blank. Did you want to, it's hard to see where people are on the.
Yeah, that's fine.
So
my camera isn't working.
Okay, so Emily says there are so many people who have been falling through the cracks. Where do we start helping? Who do we choose to help with limited resources? Meaning, who do we not help?
Which is always such a hard thing to do, because of course we, you know, it's impossible to do everything. I've been incredibly grateful at the agility of the New Israel Fund and our staff on the ground in Israel to provide over $100,000 in support in emergency grants for different initiatives that have been coming up through the beginning of this crisis, from in the early days providing public health materials in Arabic and Amharic and Yiddish, and you know, so that everybody who lives in Israel who doesn't necessarily have access to public health, like African asylum seekers, could access health information in the languages that they spoke, but also access healthcare through emergency grants to organizations like Physicians for Human Rights in Israel. There are so many different pieces of the landscape. And so I felt really, really grateful that we have been in Israel able to provide support for organizations who have to kind of recreate themselves in the moment, and for all kinds of urgent needs that have arisen in Israeli society. And I think each of us has to do a process of internal discernment to figure out where we feel like we can be useful, where we feel like we can help. And there's of course no shortage of places that need our help. And so part of it is, and I think kind of the Sinai metaphor is not a bad one in terms of needing to be able to focus our minds through all of the noise, right? If you think about Sinai, the way it's described in Torah, with kolot uvrakim, with thunder and lightning, and it was noisy and it was stinky and it was bright and it was dark and it was loud and it was confusing, and somehow they were asked to also, in the midst of all of that, hear these essential words. And that's kind of what we have to do, each in our own way, to kind of see through the chaos and figure out where we want to focus our energies. So Emily, I can't tell you where to focus. I can tell you what I've been focusing on, which is a combination of the local and of this work in Israel, and that I'm so grateful that there are so many organizations doing this essential work.
Thank you, Ayelet. Stefan, hi Stefan, do you want to ask your question?
Well, you know, I put in the chat, but essentially, is there a contradiction between being open like a wilderness to experiences and being injured or being disabled? We often hear about how the Israelites were complainers. So I just wondered if there was a tension there.
I don't know if it's a contradiction, but I do think it's a tension. I think it's hard. I think that when we are injured, when we are feeling vulnerable, we have a tendency to close up, to close our eyes, to defend ourselves, certainly to complain. The Israelites were very good at that. And the challenge is how to, when we are feeling so vulnerable and so aware of our own brokenness, how to still be open to new experiences, how to hear voices that are coming at us when we're feeling really overwhelmed and so aware of our own difficulties and our own traumas and everything that is both inconvenient and uncomfortable about our lives. And of course, part of the work of this time is about saying, yeah, I may be really unhappy and really uncomfortable and really miserable even, and I am incredibly aware of my privilege in this moment, and therefore, what do I need to do to stay to stay open. And I think that's the tension that we see the Israelites kind of bumbling through these decades in the wilderness, is they keep forgetting how to be open enough to the voice of God, how to be open enough to the experience of revelation, because they get really caught up in their own pain and their own discomfort and their own fear. And so, you know, I think the question about, you know, where are Israelis today? Are they, I think this has been a very long midbar. I think that the very real trauma and pain of Israelis, of Palestinians, often gets in the way of openness to hearing each other's voices. I mean, that's what we see all of the time. And if you're so only able to be aware of your own pain and your own loss and your own trauma, you can't let in any new ideas, and you can't hear anyone else's voice. And kind of that process of the wilderness is about how to simultaneously really feel your own pain, know that it's real, know that you have a right to be traumatized by it, and how to start to move through that trauma and to be open to other people, other experiences, other truths, and to know that just because you're deeply traumatized doesn't mean someone else isn't also. And so how do we navigate that together?
Yeah, Ayelet, if you don't mind me jumping in. I was thinking about with both your question, Stefan, and with the question we had from Evelyn about the process of going from midbar to the land of Israel in Israel today. We watched a movie in our film club, and I remember the creator's name was Michal Aviad's film about really focusing on the women who built the first kibbutzim in the Jezreel Valley. And I never really thought how broken the people were who came and first settled the land in those first aliyot. These were, young people who were fleeing life in Eastern Europe without kind of an older generation guiding through the way. And they were lost and broken people, and they both were able to do amazing things. And there was also, they were kind of flailing and didn't always know what they were doing, and they hurt people too, just at the same time as they were building. And I think that's that tension that you identified between brokenness on the one hand and opportunity in midbar is exactly like is the beautiful paradox that I think that we all love in Israel, and that also can drive us mad at various times. So I think maybe this year, this Shavuot in the midbar is giving us a new appreciation of that strange moment.
Can you see the chat, or do you want me to point out?
Give us something, Ruthie.
Yeah, give us something.
So there, Rachel has a question, Ari, regarding Midbar Abba 7:1. I'm wrestling with why the generation that came directly out of slavery in Egypt was worthy of receiving the Torah, but was not worthy of entering the land of Israel.
That's a big question. That's a very, very deep question. And I think the word worthy is a really interesting word. I don't know if that's what it's about for me when I read the text, if it's about worthiness. I think part of it is about how much transition can any one generation bear, kind of can any one lifetime bear. So to think that there was a generation that experienced being in slavery in Egypt, and also experienced leaving Egypt and crossing the Red Sea, and also experienced revelation at Sinai, that was a lot. And we see, as Stefan was mentioning before, all of the complaining and all of the difficulties of kind of navigating the wilderness, maybe that was as much as they could do. Not because they, I don't know, in my mind, it's not about not being worthy. In my mind, it's really a story about overcoming trauma and opening oneself to wonder and to change. And that sometimes that's possible to happen within one generation, and sometimes it's not. And we certainly see that in the story of the contemporary state of Israel, in terms of as Ephraim was saying, the traumatized generation of the Yeshuv of 48, and what that left for the next generation and the next generation, and we're still grappling.
Abby, let's do it. You gonna be a good girl?
So I'll take a stab at that one too, Rabbi Cohen, and I'll throw out an answer that, who knows, maybe I'll regret it in 5 minutes. But it's a little theologically revolutionary. But we're the Progressive Israel Network, so we can NIF and J Street, so we can try on new ideas. And I wonder, we saw in these texts, and I'm thinking now of the Benot Tzlofchad text, that God was learning from us as much as we were learning from God, right? God didn't think of this idea of the idea that women would need to have land. God only thought that the patriarch would need land for family, and it was only those women, Milcah, Noah, and the other daughters of Tzlofchad, who taught God that. And I wonder if God was learning too about how much this people who God had carried out of Egypt could really bear. God is fuming at them when they aren't able to wait for Moshe at getting the commandments at Sinai, and God doesn't know if God can take them into the land of Israel. And God is kind of learning about human capability as much as we're learning from God, and so maybe we were perhaps ready to start to get these guidelines of how to enter a land, but maybe we weren't ready for the responsibility of actually being masters of a country where we weren't getting manna coming from heaven to feed us, but rich people would be rich, and would they share their wealth with those who had less? How would we treat the inhabitants of the land? Maybe we needed to grow up a little bit before we could enter the land, and maybe they're still growing up to do. So we're always, I think, half a foot in the midbar and half a foot in the land, and maybe that's exactly what's happening today too. Maybe in Israel today, there's still a lot of woundedness of that Yishuv generation. There's still a lot of memory, both in the Palestinian community, and in the Israeli community, Jewish community, of suffering, and we're learning, and we're going to need to learn together how to build a more just place.
We have time for one more question, but I did want to comment following up, piggybacking on what you just said, Ephraim, on that Susan and Stephen write. One would believe the spiritual journey lies with being cast out in the wilderness, left broken, and then enlightenment. And there's a way in which, what is this process of being in the constantly in some level of midbar and some level of wilderness mean for us?
Absolutely. And the fact is, it's not a linear journey from the brokenness to the enlightenment. And Aviva Zornberg in her book on Bamidbar, which she calls Bewilderments, talks about how, basically from the Exodus from Egypt, all the rest of Shemot and all of Vayikra, all of that was 2 years. And then the Bamidbar is 38 years of wandering, of draying around in the wilderness. And that's the experience. It's this constant struggle between feeling the loss, feeling the confusion, feeling like enlightenment is never going to come, and then having these moments of revelation. And what's amazing to me about this work, about the pursuit that each of us is in terms of really loving Israel and wanting it to be its best self. It's an experience where we are so aware of the brokenness, and then there are these glimmers of enlightenment, which are amazing, which, that's what keeps me going in this work, is when I spend time with our grantees and I hear about this incredible work that's going on the ground, and that there are people and organizations that every day are devoted to the work of making sure that people are not going to be left out, that we are going to be listening to the voices of whoever the contemporary Benot Tzlofchad are, the women, the Mizrahim, the Eritreans, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, who are sounding their voices and needing to be heard, and we need to expand the tent to hear those voices and to make sure that the enlightenment is available for all who seek it, and not just the most powerful. And that's the work that we're in.
Yeah, absolutely. Amen. Amen. Thank you so much, Rabbi Ephraim and Rabbi Ayelet, and thank you all for being with us. And we're going to have a 5-minute break and then come back, or actually a 10-minute break, I think. We're coming back at 10 to 9 is the next, 8:50 is the next session, and you have 2 to choose from. If you go back to our website or back to the initial email you received, either will work. You'll see, actually, I think there's 3 sessions this next slot, and look forward to seeing you. And thank you so much, and Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Very
it was
well.
really a treat to study with all of you and
It
to
really was
see these
wonderful.
texts in a new light from all the questions. It's wonderful to have a chance to study on one's own, even better with my chavruta, with Rabbi Cohen, and then to have the texts even open up so much more full when I have questions from all of you. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.